screaming at a billionaire cartel boss over a burnt almond croissant was the undeniable tipping point of Maeve's disastrous Tuesday. It had already started terribly with coffee spilled on white silk. Yet, when she yelled, he didn't pull a gun or threaten her family. He simply looked at her, pulled out a matte black phone, and bought the entire building. He did it all just so the barista would lock the doors, forcing her to stay and drink coffee with him. Here is exactly how it happened. Rain hammered against the streaked glass of the storefront, turning the morning commute into a miserable grey blur. Water seeped through the sole of Maeve's left boot. It was a slow, freezing creep that soaked her sock, perfectly mirroring the crushing exhaustion radiating from the base of her skull. She had slept exactly 3 hours. Her shift at the architectural firm had ended at 3 a.m., and her useless, rattling radiator had kept her shivering until dawn. Standing in line at Roast and Grind, a cramped, overhyped coffee shop downtown, was her only anchor to sanity. The air inside was thick. It smelled heavily of roasted Brazilian beans, damp wool coats, and the burnt milk crusting on the steam wand. Her knuckles were white around the strap of her canvas tote bag. There were 4 people ahead of her. 4 people between her and a double-shot Americano that she desperately needed to keep her eyes open for the morning pitch meeting. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Her patience was a frayed, threadbare string holding up a grand piano. Then, the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't a polite entrance. The heavy wooden door was pushed open with enough force that it banged against the brass stopper, letting in a violent gust of freezing wind. The ambient chatter in the cafe died instantly. Maeve didn't turn around at first. She was too busy glaring at the back of a college student's head, willing him to finish ordering his complicated matcha latte. But the atmosphere in the room shifted. You could feel it in the air pressure, a sudden, heavy drop that made the hair on her arms stand up. The barista, a kid named Toby, who usually wore a permanent, lazy smirk, froze with a paper cup halfway to the espresso machine. All the colour drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick Victorian child. She finally shifted her weight and glanced back. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like an eviction notice, dressed in bespoke charcoal wool. Tall, shoulders wide enough to block out the street lamps behind him. His jaw was covered in a harsh, dark stubble, and his eyes were the colour of a winter ocean, flat, cold, and entirely indifferent. He smelled faintly of rain, ozone, and expensive peaty whiskey. Flanking him were 2 men who wore generic black suits, their hands resting loosely at their waists in a way that made her stomach knot. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't look at the line. He simply walked forward, his leather shoes making sharp, rhythmic clicks against the distressed hardwood floor, bypassing the 5 of them waiting, and stepped directly up to the register. "Double espresso, black." "Now," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. It didn't ask for permission. It was a sound used to giving orders and having them obeyed before the echo faded. Toby swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing rapidly. Yes, sir. Right away, Mr. Costa." Maeve stared. The college student in front of her took a nervous step back, bumping into her shoulder, head bowed. The woman behind her was staring at the floor. Everyone was shrinking, folding themselves into the corners of the room to avoid taking up space this man clearly believed belonged to him. Something inside her snapped. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't a sudden, heroic surge of righteousness. It was the wet sock. It was the impending migraine behind her left eye. It was the fact that she had been pushed around, talked over, and ignored for 48 hours straight, and this arrogant, suit-wearing prick was the absolute final straw. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice cracked. It wasn't a strong, cinematic shout. It was harsh and ugly, scraping out of her dry throat. The two men in black suits pivoted toward her instantly, their eyes narrowing. The man at the counter, Costa, didn't move. He didn't even twitch. She stepped out of line, her wet boot squeaking pathetically on the floorboards. "Hey," I said, "excuse me." Costa finally turned his head. The movement was slow, deliberate. When his eyes locked onto hers, a spike of pure, primal ice shot straight down her spine. The air in her lungs vanished. Up close, his face was a map of harsh angles and faint, brutal scars, one cutting sharply through the tail of his left eyebrow. He looked at her the way a commuter looks at a delay on the train tracks, with total, cold irritation. "Are you speaking to me?" he asked. The volume was low, but it carried over the hiss of the espresso machine perfectly. "Yes, I am," she snapped, her hands shaking. She crossed her arms, tucking her hands into her armpits so he wouldn't see the tremors. "The line ends back there by the pastry case. We've all been waiting for 15 minutes. Get to the back." Silence fell over the cafe, like a heavy wool blanket. The hiss of the steam wand cut off. The quiet jazz playing on the overhead speakers suddenly sounded deafeningly loud. One of his guards took a step toward her, a thick hand sliding inside his suit jacket. "Watch your mouth, girl." Costa raised a single gloved hand. 2 fingers. Barely a gesture. The guard stopped dead, stepping back into the shadows. Costa turned his body fully toward her. The physical space he occupied seemed to double. Her heart hammered frantically against her ribs, a trapped bird battering against a cage. Her brain was finally catching up to her mouth, screaming at her to apologize, to look down, to shrink like everyone else. But her jaw was locked. "I have somewhere to be," Costa said, his tone dangerously soft. "So do I," she shot back, her voice trembling now, thin and reedy. "So does everyone else. Your time isn't more valuable just because your suit costs more than my rent. Wait your turn." She was panting slightly, staring up at him. Her chest heaved. She felt entirely ridiculous, standing there in her damp, oversized thrift store coat, glaring at a man who clearly owned the city. Costa stared at her. He didn't blink. His gaze tracked from her messy, wet hair, down to the dark circles under her eyes, to her white-knuckled grip on her own arms. He was taking her apart visually, dissecting the fraying threads of her sanity. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched, a microscopic, almost invisible movement. He didn't yell. He didn't order his men to drag her out. He just turned back to the terrified barista. "Cancel the espresso," Costa said smoothly. She exhaled a shaky breath, adrenaline crashing through her system so hard she thought her knees were going to buckle. She had won. He was leaving. She turned on her heel, intending to march out the door. Caffeine be damned. She couldn't stay here. The walls were suddenly too tight, the smell of roasted coffee nauseating. But as she reached for the brass handle of the front door, she heard Costa speak again. "Who owns this property?" She froze, her hand hovering inches from the cold metal of the door handle. Behind her, the scraping sound of a stool being pushed back echoed loudly. She glanced over her shoulder. The manager, a balding man named David, who usually hid in the back office, was scrambling out from behind the curtain, wiping his sweaty hands on his apron. "Mr. Costa," David stammered, nearly tripping over a stack of cardboard cup carriers. I do. I own the business and I lease the building from—" "I don't care about the lease. I'll deal with the landlord later," Costa interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated against the floorboards. He reached into his inner breast pocket, withdrawing a sleek, matte black phone. He dialed a single number, put the phone to his ear, and waited exactly 2 seconds. "Dominic, The block on 4th and Pike, the coffee shop. Buy it." Maeve's stomach plummeted. The remaining customers in the shop exchanged wide, terrified glances. "Yes, right now," Costa continued quietly into the phone, his eyes flicking over to where she stood, frozen by the exit. "Whatever the asking price is, triple it. Have the paperwork sent to my office by noon." He hung up, sliding the phone back into his coat. The casualness of it was sickening. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even looked at David, the man whose entire livelihood had just been purchased with a 10-second phone call. Costa finally turned his attention to the trembling manager. "The shop is closed." David blinked, completely paralyzed. "City, sir?" "Closed," Costa repeated. He gestured vaguely toward the windows. "Clear them out. Lock the doors." Panic erupted. The college student abandoned his bag on the floor and bolted for the door, nearly knocking Maeve over in his haste. The woman in the corner practically sprinted past her, the bell chiming frantically as the door opened and closed, letting in bursts of icy wind and rain. She snapped out of her stupor, her chest tightened with genuine suffocating panic. She grabbed the handle and pushed. A heavy, leather-gloved hand slammed flat against the glass, right above her head. The force of it made the thick pain shudder in its frame. She gasped, stumbling backward. One of the guards, the massive one with a broken nose, stood between her and the door. He didn't say a word. He just clicked the heavy deadbolt into place. The metallic clack sounded like a gunshot in the suddenly empty room. "Hey!" she yelled, spinning around to face Costa. Her voice was shrill now, the exhaustion evaporating into sheer terror. "You can't do this. Unlock that door." Costa stood by the counter, slowly unbuttoning his bespoke suit jacket. He took it off, folding it meticulously over the back of a wooden chair. "Toby," he said, ignoring her entirely. The barista squeaked. Yes?" "2 double-shot Americanos. Real mugs, not paper." "I don't want your coffee," she shouted, taking a step toward him, then stopping as the second guard shifted his weight menacingly. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to jam them into her coat pockets. "Let me out of here. You can't just lock people in a building." Costa finally looked at her. He leaned his hip against the counter, crossing his arms over a crisp, white button-down shirt that looked like it cost more than her car. The hostility in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical curiosity. It was worse. It felt like being studied under a microscope by a predator trying to decide if she were venomous or just loud. "You were the one complaining about the weight," Costa said smoothly. His accent was faint, something Eastern European buried under decades of polished American wealth. "There is no line now. Sit down." "I'm going to call the police," she threatened. It was a hollow threat, and they both knew it. Her phone was dead, buried at the bottom of her tote bag, and even if it wasn't, the way David was cowering behind the pastry case suggested the police wouldn't do a damn thing against this man. Costa let out a soft, breathy sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. "Call them. Tell them Victor Costa locked you in a coffee shop. See how fast they hang up." Victor Costa. The name clicked into place, sinking like a stone in her gut. She didn't run in criminal circles, but you couldn't live in this city without knowing the name. Real estate, shipping lines, and rumors of bodies buried in the concrete foundations of the new high-rises. He wasn't just a rich arsehole. He was the apex predator of the city's underbelly. Her throat closed up. The metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth. She had just screamed at a man who could make her disappear before her lunch break. "Please," she whispered. The defiance drained out of her, leaving nothing but the bone-deep weariness she had walked in with. Her shoulders slumped. "Just let me go. I'm late for work. I'm sorry I yelled. Okay? I'm sorry." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. The apology didn't seem to please him. It seemed to annoy him. He uncrossed his arms and pushed off the counter, taking a slow, measured step toward her. Instinctively, she backed up, her shoulders hitting the cold glass of the locked front door. "You weren't sorry 3 minutes ago," Victor said, his voice dropping into a low, quiet hum as he closed the distance between them. He stopped just outside her personal space, close enough that she could smell the sharp scent of vetiver and rain clinging to his clothes. "3 minutes ago, you looked ready to tear my throat out over a spot in line. Where did that fire go?" "I realized who you are," she muttered, staring at the knot of his silk tie, because looking at his face felt too dangerous. And I don't want to die over a burnt croissant." Victor stared down at her. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the shop was the rain lashing against the windows and the whir of the espresso grinder behind the counter. "Sit down," he repeated, his voice softer this time, but infinitely heavier. "Drink the coffee. Then you can go." She sat. Her legs wouldn't have held her up much longer, anyway. The wooden chair was uncomfortable, the table slightly sticky with old syrup residue. It was a table for two by the window, offering a perfect, cruel view of the busy sidewalk outside. People walked by, huddled under umbrellas, completely oblivious to the hostage situation happening inches away behind the tinted glass. Victor sat opposite her. He didn't slouch. He sat with the terrifying stillness of a man who never had to worry about what was behind him. Toby, hands shaking so badly the cups rattled against the saucers, approached the table. He set a steaming white mug in front of Victor and another in front of Maeve. Dark, bitter liquid sloshed over the rim of her cup, staining the porcelain. "Theo, thank you, Mr. Costa," Toby whispered, backing away quickly. Victor ignored him, keeping his dark eyes fixed on her face. He picked up a small silver spoon, slowly stirring his black coffee. The clinking sound grated against her raw nerves. "Drink," he commanded softly. She stared at the black liquid. Her stomach churned. She was desperate for caffeine 10 minutes ago, but now the thought of swallowing anything made her want to gag. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers wrapping around the hot ceramic. The heat grounded her slightly, burning the chill out of her palms. She lifted the mug and took a small sip. It burned her tongue, bitter and acidic. Victor watched her swallow. He hadn't touched his own cup. "What is your name?" "Maeve," she croaked. She cleared her throat, trying to find some shred of dignity. "Maeve Gallagher." "Maeve." He tested the syllables, his deep voice wrapping around the word in a way that made her skin prickle. "Tell me, Maeve, do you make a habit of screaming at strangers in public, or am I a special case?" She set the mug down a little too hard. The ceramic clacked against the saucer. "I make a habit of calling out people who act like the rules don't apply to them." "The rules don't apply to me." It was stated as a simple, objective fact. The sky is blue, water is wet. Victor Costa does not wait in line. "Clearly," she muttered, wiping a stray drop of coffee from the table with her thumb. The adrenaline was fading, and her exhaustion was rushing back in to fill the void, making her reckless again. "So what is this? You bought a building and locked me inside to punish me? Going to torture me with bad jazz and overpriced espresso until I apologize with enough groveling?" Victor stopped stirring his coffee. He laid the spoon down on the table, the movement precise. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the sticky table, unbothered by the grime. "I kept you here because people do not yell at me, Maeve. They whisper, they beg, they run." His dark eyes searched her face, scanning the dark bags under her eyes, the pale, clammy skin of her cheeks. "You didn't run. Your hands were shaking, Your pulse was racing. I could see it beating in your neck. But you stood there and told me to get to the back of the line. Why? I was tired, she answered honestly, a bitter, exhausted laugh escaping her lips. I haven't slept. My radiator is broken. My boss has been breathing down my neck for a proposal that's due in an hour, and my boots leak. I just wanted a coffee. I didn't care who you were. I just wanted you out of my way. It was the most pathetic, unheroic confession in the world. She wasn't a brave woman standing up to a tyrant. She was an overworked, underpaid architect who had momentarily lost her grip on reality because of a wet sock. She expected him to laugh. She expected disgust, or at least a sneer of superiority. Instead, Victor's expression softened by a fraction of a millimeter. The hard, violent lines around his mouth relaxed. He looked down at her feet, hidden beneath the table, and then back up to her face. "Take off your coat," he ordered quietly. She blinked, her grip tightening on the coffee mug. "What?" "No. Your coat is wet. You are shivering. Take it off." "I'm fine," she lied, her teeth practically chattering as the damp wool pressed against her back. Victor didn't argue. He simply reached across the small table. She flinched, pressing herself hard into the back of the chair, but his large, warm hands bypassed her face entirely. He caught the lapels of her cheap, soaked coat, and with a swift, economical movement, pulled the fabric down her shoulders. She gasped at the sudden intrusion of his space, the heat radiating off his hands. He easily stripped the heavy, wet wool off her arms, tossing it onto the empty chair beside him. The sudden lack of the cold, damp weight was a relief, though she would rather die than admit it. Before she could protest, Victor picked up his own discarded suit jacket, the heavy, dry charcoal wool, and draped it over her shoulders. It was massive on her. It swallowed her upper body entirely. The silk lining was still warm from his body heat, and the heavy scent of vetiver and dark spice completely overwhelmed the smell of the cafe. She sat frozen, swamped in his jacket, staring at him in complete bewilderment. "Drink your coffee," Victor repeated, leaning back in his chair. He finally picked up his own mug, taking a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers over the rim of the cup. "We have time to kill before your proposal is due." Her phone buzzed in her canvas tote bag, a harsh, rattling vibration against the floorboards. She jumped, her knee banging hard against the underside of the small table. The dull throb of pain barely registered through the thick layer of adrenaline still pulsing in her veins. "Answer it," Victor said. He wasn't looking at her. His attention was focused on the heavy silver watch on his left wrist, adjusting the leather strap with agonizingly slow, deliberate movements. She reached down, her fingers numb and clumsy, and yanked the phone out of the bag. The screen was cracked diagonally, a casualty of a dropped bag 3 months ago that she couldn't afford to fix. The bright white numbers glared back at her. 8:14 a.m. Beneath the time, a text notification from her boss, Richard, sat like a live grenade on her lock screen. "Where are the physical renders? Client is here at 8:45. Don't screw this up, Maeve." Her stomach twisted into a cold, tight knot. She pressed the power button, plunging the screen back into darkness, and dropped the phone face down on the sticky table. "Trouble?" Victor asked, his voice low. "Just my boss," she muttered, rubbing her temples. The migraine was fully blossoming now, a sharp, rhythmic pulsing behind her left eye, reminding me that if I am not standing in the conference room in exactly 31 minutes with a stack of flawless architectural renders, I will be looking for a new job. Victor leaned back, the wooden chair groaning slightly under his weight. He steepled his fingers, resting them lightly against his chin. The scar running through his eyebrow caught the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the cafe, making the pale, jagged tissue stand out against his tan skin. "You hate this job," he stated. Not a question, an observation. "I don't hate it," she lied instinctively. Then she looked at his eyes, flat, unblinking, utterly devoid of patience for social niceties. She slumped, letting out a heavy, rattling breath. "Fine, it's soul-crushing. I spend 80 hours a week drafting brutalist parking structures for a man who thinks cutting corners on rebar is a clever accounting trick. But it pays the rent. Barely." "And fixes the radiator?" She froze, her hand halfway to her coffee mug. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "How did you—" "You mentioned it," Victor said smoothly, though there was a dark, amused flicker in his eyes. "You said you were tired, your boots leak, your boss is breathing down your neck, and your radiator is broken. I listen, Maeve. It's a rare skill." He snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the espresso machine. The larger guard, the one who had bolted the door, stepped forward instantly, moving with a silent, heavy grace that made her stomach churn. "Sir," the guard murmured, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "Find out where she lives," Victor ordered, his tone shifting from the conversational hum he used with her to a flat, dead calm. "Have a crew go to her apartment, replace the heating unit, fix whatever else is broken. If the landlord objects, remind him who owns the block." "No," she blurted out, half standing out of her chair. Her knees banged against the table again, spilling a dark splash of coffee over the rim of her mug onto the saucer. "You can't do that. You don't know where I live, and I'm not telling you." Victor didn't move. He just tilted his head, watching her panic with that same clinical, terrifying curiosity. "Sit down, Maeve." "I don't want your help," she said, her voice shaking. She gripped the edges of the table, her knuckles turning white. "I don't want your guys breaking into my apartment. I yelled at you. You kept me here to prove a point. Point taken. You own the city. I'm a speck of dirt on your shoe. Can we call it even now?" "I didn't keep you here to prove a point," Victor replied quietly. He picked up his coffee spoon again, turning it slowly between his thumb and forefinger. The metal caught the light. "I kept you here because you were the first person in 5 years to look me in the eye and demand something without trembling. Until now." He gestured vaguely with the spoon toward her white-knuckled grip on the table. She forced herself to let go of the table, dropping her hands into her lap. She was trembling. She hated that he could see it. She hated that her body was reacting to him like prey, even as her brain desperately tried to maintain some illusion of control. "I'm not letting your men into my apartment," she said stubbornly, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Victor stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then he looked at the guard. "Cancel the crew. Just find the landlord and buy the building, then evict him and transfer the deed to her." "Understood," the guard rumbled, stepping back into the shadows. Her jaw dropped. The sheer, suffocating weight of his wealth crashed over her. "Are you out of your mind?" "I am simply removing obstacles," Victor said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He grimaced slightly, as if the bitter taste was finally registering. "You are exhausted. You are stressed. I find both of those things visually unpleasant. Now tell me about the pitch." She stared at him, her brain stalling. The jump from casual real estate extortion to polite workplace inquiry gave her mental whiplash. "The pitch," she repeated numbly. "The client at 8:45, Victor prompted. He rested his elbows on the table, leaning in slightly. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She could see the faint, dark stubble along his jawline, the tiny, almost imperceptible lines around his eyes. He didn't look like a mob boss from a movie. He didn't look slick or polished. He looked like a man who had fought his way out of a very dark, very bloody hole and had clawed his way to the top of the skyline. "It's a waterfront development in the South District," she said, the words tumbling out on autopilot. Talking about work was a life raft. It was concrete. It was real. Mixed-use commercial and residential. My boss, Richard, designed a glass and steel monstrosity that looks like every other soulless block in this city. "South District," Victor murmured, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The soil there is mostly clay and landfill from the old shipping yards. Heavy subsidence." She blinked, genuinely caught off guard. "Yes, exactly. The bedrock is almost 90 feet down. So a heavy steel superstructure clad in glass is going to sink within 5 years, unless they sink caissons deep enough to hit rock," Victor said. He wasn't guessing. He knew the terrain intimately. She suddenly remembered the rumors about his control over the concrete and steel unions. He didn't just build the city, he poured its foundations. "Richard doesn't want to pay for deep caissons," she said, her frustration overriding her fear for a split second. She leaned forward, matching his posture without realizing it. "He wants to use standard friction piles. He claims the stress load calculations will hold, but he's massaging the data. He's using outdated seismic models to justify it." "He's cheap," Victor corrected, his voice a low, dark rumble. "And stupid. When the foundation cracks, the structural integrity of the glass curtain wall will fail. You'll have shattered panels dropping onto the sidewalk in the first winter storm." "That's exactly what I told him," she said, her voice rising slightly, a strange, breathless excitement catching in her throat. She had spent 3 weeks arguing this exact point to a room full of middle-aged men in expensive suits who had treated her like a hysterical intern. Now she was sitting across from a cartel boss who was casually validating her engineering concerns. "I drafted a completely different foundational approach. Deep-driven concrete piers, tied into a raft slab. It costs 20% more up front, but it prevents the entire structure from twisting on its axis." "Show me," Victor demanded. "Show you?" She let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "I don't have the blueprints on me. They're on the server at work." Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a matte black fountain pen. He slid it across the sticky table, followed by a crisp white napkin from the dispenser. "Draw it." She stared at the pen, then at him. The flat, unyielding demand in his eyes left no room for negotiation. Her hands were still shaking slightly, but the familiar urge to solve a structural problem was a powerful anchor. She picked up the pen. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, the metal warm from his pocket. She began to sketch. She drew the shoreline, the retaining wall, and the loose, unstable soil composition. She mapped out the stress lines, drawing the friction piles Richard wanted, showing how the lateral force of the tide would slowly push the foundation out of alignment. Then she sketched her solution, the deep, thick concrete piers anchoring into the bedrock. Victor watched in absolute silence. He didn't look at her face. He watched her hands. He tracked the movement of the pen, the dark ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper napkin. The only sound in the cafe was the scratching of the nib and the relentless rain against the window. When she finished, she pushed the napkin toward him. She felt entirely raw, stripped down to her bare, overworked nerves. Victor studied the drawing for a long time. His face gave away nothing. His jaw was clenched, a muscle feathering near his ear. Finally he looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, suffocating intensity. "This is brilliant work, Maeve," he said, quietly. There was no mockery in his tone, no condescension. It was a simple, absolute truth. "You are wasted on a man who counts pennies on concrete." Her breath hitched, Her chest tightened so hard it physically hurt. No one had ever called her work brilliant. She was used to red ink, condescending pats on the shoulder, and her designs being cannibalized by men whose names went on the plaque. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, looking away, staring blindly at the pastry case across the room. "He's pitching his design today. If I don't show up with the renders for his friction pile disaster, I'm fired." "Then let him fire you," Victor said. She snapped her gaze back to him, angry now. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a spike of bitter, defensive rage. "Easy for you to say. You just bought a building over a cup of coffee. If I lose my job, I lose my apartment. I don't have a safety net. I don't have offshore accounts." Victor's hand shot across the table. The movement was so fast she flinched, her shoulders slamming into the back of the chair. But he didn't grab her. He placed his large, scarred hand flat over the paper napkin, completely covering her drawing. "You don't need a safety net," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a dark, terrifying promise. "You need a patron." The silence stretched, pulling tight like a wire about to snap. She stared at his hand. The knuckles were rough, the skin tanned and marked with a history of violence she didn't want to understand. Underneath that hand was her design, her brain on paper. The implication hung heavily in the air between them, suffocating and thick. A patron. She knew exactly what that meant in his world. It wasn't a scholarship. It wasn't a business loan. It was ownership. Victor Costa didn't invest in things. He possessed them. Her phone vibrated again against the table. 8:31 a.m. The sound shattered the spell. The reality of the world outside this bizarre, hermetically sealed bubble came rushing back in. The rain, the traffic, Richard's red-faced screaming, the overdue electrical bill sitting on her kitchen counter. She grabbed her phone and shoved it into her pocket. She reached for the lapels of Victor's jacket, intending to pull it off, but his hand moved from the napkin to her wrist. His grip was not painful. It wasn't tight enough to bruise, but it was immovable. His fingers wrapped around the delicate bones of her wrist, his thumb resting directly over her frantic, racing pulse. He could feel exactly how terrified she was. "Leave the coat on," Victor commanded softly. "I need to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She tried to pull her arm back, but he held firm. "I have 14 minutes to get across town. If I walk now, I can make the subway." "You are not taking the subway," Victor said. He finally released her wrist, the sudden absence of his heat leaving a cold patch on her skin. He stood up. The sheer size of him dominated the small space. He buttoned his white shirt at the collar, adjusting his tie with one hand. "Dominic is outside with the car. He will drive you." "No." The word slipped out before her brain could filter it. Victor paused, his hand dropping from his collar. He looked down at her, his eyes darkening to the color of wet asphalt. "Excuse me?" She stood up, pushing the wooden chair back. Her legs felt like jelly, trembling so badly she had to lock her knees to stay upright. She pulled his heavy wool coat tighter around her shoulders, an involuntary defense mechanism. It smelled like him, and it made her feel sick with how much she wanted to disappear inside it. "I said no." She forced the words out, keeping her chin lifted. "I yelled at you. You kept me here. We talked. Now it's over. I am going to walk out that door, and I am going to the subway, and I am going to deal with my boss. Alone." She expected him to explode. She expected the violence that hovered just beneath the surface of his skin to finally break through. The guards by the door shifted, the leather of their holsters creaking audibly in the quiet room. But Victor just stared at her. He looked at her messy, damp hair, her pale face, and the stubborn, terrified set of her jaw. Slowly, the corner of his mouth curved up into a ghost of a smile. It wasn't a warm expression. It was the smile of a hunter watching a trap spring shut. "Very well, Maeve," he said smoothly. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the front door with a sweep of his arm. "You may walk, but keep the coat. The weather is turning." She didn't argue about the coat. She didn't have the strength left. She grabbed her canvas tote bag, ignoring the squelch of her wet left boot, and walked toward the exit. The air in the cafe felt impossibly heavy. As she approached the door, the massive guard with the broken nose looked at Victor. Victor gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The guard reached out and violently twisted the deadbolt. The clack echoed loudly, followed by the squeal of the brass handle turning. He pulled the heavy door open, letting in a blast of freezing, wet wind. The noise of the city, sirens, tires splashing through puddles, the hum of traffic, crashed over her like a physical blow. She stepped onto the threshold, the rain instantly hitting her face, stinging her cheeks. She paused, her hand gripping the doorframe. She couldn't stop herself. She turned back one last time. Victor was still standing by the small table. He hadn't moved. He was watching her with those flat, dead eyes, the white paper napkin with her design still resting on the table in front of him. "Good luck with your pitch, Maeve," Victor called out over the sound of the rain, his voice cutting through the noise with chilling clarity. "I have a feeling Richard is going to be very receptive to your ideas today." Her stomach bottomed out. The cold tone of his voice carried a promise that had absolutely nothing to do with architectural integrity. She turned and practically ran out into the storm, the heavy silk lining of his coat flapping against her legs. She hit the sidewalk, dodging umbrellas and briefcases, her heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She made it to the subway entrance, plunging down the concrete stairs into the humid, subterranean gloom. As she swiped her worn Metro card, she glanced down at her wrist, rubbing the spot where his fingers had rested. Her pulse was still racing, loud and erratic in her ears. She thought she had walked away. She thought she had stood her ground and won her freedom. But as she stood on the crowded platform, shivering inside a billionaire mobster's bespoke suit coat, staring at the dark tunnel ahead, a cold, hard realization settled heavily in her gut. Victor Costa hadn't let her go. He had just lengthened the leash. The elevator bank at Harrison and Webb Architecture smelled permanently of ozone and burnt dust. She stood in the brushed steel box, watching the floor numbers tick upward in glowing red. Floor 12, floor 13. Her left boot squelched with every minor shift of her weight. She looked like a deranged vagrant. Victor's massive charcoal coat swallowed her frame, the sleeves rolled up twice, just so her hands could emerge. The silk lining clung to her damp blouse. Floor 15. The doors dinged and slid open. She braced herself for the screaming. Richard was a man who communicated primarily through spit and vein-popping volume. She fully expected him to be waiting by the reception desk, ready to fire her publicly before she could even take off this ridiculous coat. The reception area was dead silent. Sarah, the chronically bored receptionist, was sitting rigid behind her curved desk. Her headset hung loosely around her neck. She wasn't typing. She was staring straight ahead, her face the color of skim milk. "Sarah?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. She flinched, her eyes snapping to Maeve. She looked at her wet hair, down to the oversized men's coat, and then swallowed hard. "Conference room B, Maeve. They're waiting." Her stomach plummeted. The client was already here. She was dead. She was walking the plank. She trudged down the carpeted hallway, the squelch of her boot the only sound in the sterile environment. The glass walls of conference room B loomed at the end of the corridor. Through the frosted middle pane, She could see silhouettes. 3 men. She pushed the heavy glass door open. It hissed on its pneumatic hinges. "Richard, I'm sorry," she started, the apology tumbling out of her mouth automatically. "The subway stalled, and I didn't have time to print the renders for the friction piles." She stopped. The air in the room was entirely wrong. It smelled like cold sweat, expensive cologne, and sheer, unadulterated terror. Richard was standing at the head of the long oak table. His light blue button-down shirt was dark with pit stains. His tie was loosened. He looked like he had aged a decade in the 20 minutes since he had texted her. Sitting to his right was Arthur Pendleton, the city zoning commissioner and their supposed client. He looked equally green, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Sitting at the far end of the table, perfectly relaxed in a Herman Miller chair, was Dominic, Victor Costa's guard. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket anymore. The heavy bulk of his shoulder holster was clearly visible over his dark shirt. He was casually flipping through one of Richard's glossy portfolios, looking profoundly bored. Dominic looked up as she froze in the doorway. His eyes flicked to the coat draping her shoulders. A microscopic nod of recognition passed his lips. "Ah, Maeve," Richard squeaked. His voice was an octave higher than normal. He practically lunged across the room, grabbing her elbow and pulling her inside. "Right on time. Perfect. We were just discussing the foundational approach." She stared at him. "The friction piles." "God, no," Richard said, his eyes wide and panicked. He wiped a hand across his gleaming forehead. No. That was a terrible idea. Short-sighted. Dangerous, really. I was just telling Mr. Pendleton here that my senior architect, that's you, Maeve, had drafted a brilliant, fully realized plan for deep-driven concrete piers, a raft slab, the only responsible choice for the South District. Her jaw physically dropped. She looked at Arthur Pendleton. The man was nodding vigorously, looking as though Richard had just suggested curing cancer. "Absolutely," Arthur stammered, avoiding Dominic's gaze. "Safety first, whatever the cost. The budget is flexible, very flexible." She looked at Dominic. He slowly closed the portfolio, letting it slap softly against the wood table. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. "Maeve," Richard said, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. He was silently begging her, pleading. "Do you have the drawings? The piers?" Her brain short-circuited. She thought back to the cafe. "I have a feeling Richard is going to be very receptive to your ideas today." Victor hadn't just made a threat. He had dismantled her boss's entire reality in the time it took her to ride the C train 6 stops. She started, her mouth dry. She reached into the oversized pocket of Victor's coat. Her fingers brushed against a thick, folded piece of paper she hadn't realized was there. She pulled it out. It was her napkin sketch. Only it wasn't just a napkin anymore. It had been slipped inside a clear plastic sleeve. Attached to it with a brass paperclip was a blank check from a private holding company, signed simply, V. Costa. The room stared at the napkin in her hand. She walked slowly to the whiteboard. She didn't take off the coat. She felt strangely armored by it. The heavy wool was a physical barrier between her and the pathetic, cowering men in the room. She picked up a dry erase marker. Her hand wasn't shaking anymore. "The bedrock," she said, her voice shockingly steady, "is 90 feet down. Here is how we reach it." The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. It wasn't a pitch, it was a surrender. Arthur Pendleton approved every structural change, signed off on the massive budget increase, and practically ran out of the room the second the paperwork was stamped. Dominic stood up slowly. He adjusted his holster, gave her another brief, unreadable nod, and walked out without a single syllable. The heavy glass door swung shut. Richard collapsed into a chair. He put his head between his knees and breathed in harsh, ragged gasps. She stood by the whiteboard, staring at her own schematics. The marker dust coated her fingertips. "What did you do, Maeve?" Richard whispered. He didn't sound angry. He sounded hollow. She turned around. "I got a coffee." Richard let out a dark, broken laugh. He sat up, rubbing his hands over his face. "A coffee? Right. Well, I hope it was a good one." He pointed a trembling finger at the check resting on the table. "Do you know who that is?" "I have an idea." "He bought the firm," Richard said bluntly. She blinked. "What?" 20 minutes ago, a shell company bought out Webb's shares and then made me an offer I literally couldn't refuse. If I didn't sign, they were going to freeze my assets and have me investigated for structural fraud on the Hudson project. Richard stared at the grain of the oak table. "I'm out. I'm packing my office. The firm is yours." The room spun. "Mine. I'm a junior architect." "You're the lead now," Richard said bitterly, pushing himself up from the chair. He looked at her, his eyes dropping to the massive charcoal coat. A flash of something ugly and knowing crossed his face. "Whatever arrangement you made with him, I hope you know what you're doing. Men like Victor Costa don't build things. They own things. And they break whatever they can't own." He walked out, leaving her alone in the silent room. She didn't stay to pack his boxes. She didn't stay to talk to Sarah. She grabbed her tote bag, folded the plastic-sleeved napkin into her pocket, and left the building. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and gleaming under a bruised grey sky. The walk to the subway was a blur. Her mind was a chaotic static of numbers, concrete mixtures, and the terrifying, heavy silence of Victor Costa's eyes. Her apartment building was in the Narrows, a neglected neighborhood that always smelled faintly of sulfur and rotting garbage. She climbed the 4 flights of stairs, her wet boots squeaking against the chipped linoleum. The hallway reeked of boiled cabbage. She jammed her key into the sticky lock of 4B and pushed the door open. A wave of dry, blistering heat hit her face. She froze in the doorway. Her apartment was usually a meat locker by November. Now, it felt like a sauna. She dropped her bag and walked slowly into the cramped living room. The ancient, peeling radiator under the window was gone. In its place was a sleek, matte black cast-iron unit, radiating a steady, silent wave of heat. The wall behind it had been freshly plastered and painted. She stared at it, her chest tightening. She felt violated. She felt seen. She felt a terrifying, shameful surge of relief that she wouldn't have to sleep in 3 sweaters tonight. She walked into the tiny kitchenette. Sitting perfectly centered on the cheap laminate counter was a heavy, manila envelope. Her hands were shaking again as she reached for it. She broke the wax seal. Inside was a stack of legal documents. She skimmed the heavy legalese, her eyes catching on key phrases. Deed of transfer. Property of Maeve Gallagher. Paid in full. He hadn't just fixed the radiator. He had bought the slumlord out, transferred the deed to her name, and paid the property taxes for the next 10 years. At the bottom of the envelope was a small, thick piece of cardstock. A heavy, embossed crest sat at the top. Beneath it, written in the same sharp, angular handwriting that had signed the check, was a single line. The foundation must be stable before we build. V. She backed away from the counter until her shoulders hit the refrigerator. She slid down the cold metal door until she hit the linoleum floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She buried her face in the collar of his suit jacket, breathing in the scent of vetiver and storm clouds. She was trapped. Not in a cage, but in a fortress, and she didn't know if the man who built it was trying to protect her or make sure she could never leave. Sleep was a biological impossibility. The new cast-iron radiator hissed in the corner of her apartment, a rhythmic, metallic ticking that sounded like a bomb timer. It pumped out a dry, suffocating heat that baked the lingering smell of boiled cabbage into the peeling wallpaper, leaving her throat feeling like sandpaper. She spent the entire night sitting cross-legged on the warped linoleum floor, Victor's charcoal coat bunched around her shoulders like a bulletproof vest. She stared at the manila envelope until the street lamps bleeding through the blinds gave way to a bruised, smoggy dawn. By 8 o'clock, her boots were dry. The leather had warped and stiffened from the rain, pinching her toes with every step. She put them on anyway. She shoved her arms back into the massive sleeves of Victor's coat, grabbed the envelope, and locked her door. She didn't take the C train to the architectural firm. She took the express line straight to the financial district. The Costa Holdings building was a brutalist monolith of black glass and steel that loomed over the intersection like a sheer cliff face. The morning sun hit the facade, but the tinted windows didn't reflect the light. They seemed to swallow it whole. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors, the canvas of her tote bag scraping against her hip. The lobby was a cathedral of chilled marble and aggressive silence. The air conditioning was cranked so high it made her eyes water. It smelled faintly of ozone and expensive floor wax. There was no directory, no bustling crowds of interns, just a sweeping desk carved from raw obsidian, flanked by 2 men in dark, perfectly tailored suits. They didn't ask for her ID. They didn't ask if she had an appointment. As her warped boots squeaked against the pristine floor, the taller man simply pressed a button hidden beneath the counter. A frosted glass elevator door behind him slid open with a soft, hydraulic hiss. They were expecting her. The realization made her stomach pitch violently. The ride to the top floor made her ears pop 3 times. She stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked unhinged. Pale skin, dark bags under her eyes, drowning in a cartel boss's bespoke wool jacket. When the doors opened, there was no reception area. Just 80 feet of distressed herringbone hardwood, leading up to a massive desk made of dark slate. Victor was sitting behind it. He had discarded the suit jacket. He wore a crisp, white button-down shirt, the collar undone, the sleeves rolled up past his forearms to reveal a thick, jagged scar snaking up his left wrist. He was leaning over a sprawling, physical blueprint, a heavy brass architectural compass resting near his elbow. He looked completely at home, a predator at rest in his high-altitude cave. He didn't look up as she crossed the room. The harsh clack squeak of her stiff boots echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows, an ugly, disruptive noise in a perfectly engineered space. She stopped inches from the edge of the slate desk. She slammed the manila envelope down. It slapped against the stone, sliding a few inches before hitting the brass compass with a sharp clink. Victor stopped tracing a line on the blueprint. He didn't flinch. He slowly capped the fountain pen in his hand, placed it precisely parallel to the edge of the paper, and finally looked up. His eyes were the color of wet asphalt, flat and unreadable. He took in her rigid posture, the furious trembling of her hands, and the heavy wool coat she still hadn't taken off. "Take it back," she said. Her voice was a gravelly rasp, ruined by the dry heat of the radiator and sheer exhaustion. Victor leaned back in his leather chair. It groaned faintly under his weight. "I am not a retailer, Maeve. I don't process returns." "I don't want a building," she snapped, leaning forward, pressing her palms flat against the freezing slate desk. She was running on 0 sleep and pure, volatile adrenaline. "I don't want a fake promotion handed to me by a thug in a conference room. I don't want to be your charity case or your pet project." You saw me have a mental breakdown over a place in line, and you decided to play God with my life." Victor stood up. The sudden movement was fluid and terrifying. The sheer mass of him forced her brain to scream at her to step back, but she locked her knees. He walked slowly around the edge of the desk, his leather shoes completely silent against the hardwood. He stopped so close to her that the heavy scent of vetiver and dark spice completely washed out the sterile smell of the office. "I didn't decide to play God," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating hum that rattled against her ribs. "I decided to clear the wreckage out of your way. Richard was a parasite. Your landlord was a slumlord. I simply removed them." "By buying them out!" she yelled, throwing her hands up in the air, the massive sleeves of his coat falling past her wrists. "You can't just buy people's lives to fix them. You don't know me. You don't know what I want." "I know exactly what you want," he stated flatly. He reached out. The movement was fast, but not violent. His rough, calloused fingers wrapped around her wrist, pressing against the frantic, hammering beat of her pulse. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "You think I want a pet?" Victor murmured, taking a deliberate half-step closer. The heat radiating off his chest seeped through the thick layers of wool and cotton, separating them. "Pets are boring, Maeve. They do what they are told. They roll over. They don't scream at me in crowded rooms. They don't draw brilliant, structurally flawless engineering solutions on cheap coffee napkins and dare me to look at them." He let go of her wrist. His hand moved upward, his knuckles lightly grazing the line of her jaw as he tucked a stray, messy curl behind her ear. The contrast between the violence etched into his skin and the agonizing gentleness of the touch sent a sharp, involuntary shiver down her spine. "I want a builder," Victor said quietly. His dark eyes searched her face, systematically stripping away the layers of her cynical defiance until he found the raw, terrified ambition hiding underneath. "I control the concrete in this city. I control the steel. I own the land. But the skyline is ugly. It is crumbling because cowards like Richard build it cheap. I want you to tear it down. I want you to build it right, with my money, with my protection. And what do you get in return?" she whispered. Her throat felt painfully tight. Victor's gaze dropped to her mouth for a fraction of a second. It was the only tell he had given her. A microscopic crack in the ice. "Everything else," he said. It wasn't a romance novel confession. It wasn't soft or sweet. It was a blood pact. It was a hostile takeover of her entire existence, wrapped in the one thing she had craved since she first learned how to read a stress load calculation: unlimited resources. No bureaucratic red tape. No cheap compromises. All she had to do was sell her soul to the devil standing in front of her. She looked down at the manila envelope sitting on the slate desk. She looked past him, out the floor-to-ceiling windows, at the sprawling, chaotic skyline of the city, a city built on bad foundations and dirty money. And then she looked back up at the monster in the bespoke shirt who had given her a working radiator and the keys to a kingdom. She reached up and grabbed the lapels of his charcoal coat, pulling the heavy wool tighter around her chest. "The deep-driven piers will cost 30% more, not 20, she said, her voice deadpan, the adrenaline finally settling into a cold, hard resolve. "And I don't work weekends." Victor stared at her. For the first time since she had met him, a genuine smile broke across his face. It was a dark, dangerous thing, like a crack of lightning illuminating a pitch-black sky. "We have a deal, Maeve." Did Maeve make the ultimate power move, or did she just walk into a beautifully designed cage? When ambition meets organized crime, the blueprints get complicated. If you loved this deep dive into the gritty, tension-filled world of Mafia romance, hit that like button. It helps us bring more dark, grounded stories to life. Who do you think really holds the power now, Maeve or Victor? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance addicts, and hit subscribe and the notification bell so you never miss a new story.